So when we get good rains and the waterholes fill up around Uluru, even on top of the rock, a little hard-shell shrimp can hatch and live. So life in some of the most unlikely places. Now folks, in 1994 the park was listed a second time for its cultural values, and that's due to the people that live here known as the Anangu. The name Anangu means we the people, and being very traditional people, so they've been here in Central Australia for more than 30,000 years and still practicing today their traditional way and custom, which is known as Tjuta. Tjuta does not have any direct English translation. It is a meaning of a lot of things. In a nutshell, it is their law, their lifestyle, their religion, their code of conduct. It embodies the ways that they travel around the countryside following the seasons and cycles of the plants. They would keep their ancestral spirits or ancestral beings known as the Chukaricha alive by chanting their stories and following their pathways known as songlines. He also held special ceremonies along the way, which would be at certain intervals of their lives, and going through certain rites of passage and passing on certain knowledge, which would be all about survival and their spirituality of the countryside. In the very beginning of the creation days, the Chukaricha, or spiritual ancestors, travelled across the barren landscape, creating all the natural features that we see, from the mountains to the rivers, to the waterholes, the plants, the animals, and lastly the people. So the people became the custodians. People were given these songlines or stories which bound up those sacred laws of how to look after the country. So they were hunter-gatherers. They travelled around their tribal lands holding these ceremonies and looking after country. Now folks, in 1985, as the Anangu had a land claim on this region since the 1970s. They were finally granted the land of the National Park back to the Anangu people, and this was on the 26th of October in 1985, so a little over 30 years ago. And they actually leased it to Parks Australia for a 99-year lease. Now, the park is actually jointly managed by Parks Australia and the Anangu, and the laws which actually govern the national park are the way of Tjuta, or the custom or laws of Tjuta. And some of the ways that we can actually see that being implemented into the national park is actually through the way of fire management. Now, as we head up this road at various places, you might notice that the grasses on either side of the road are, like say the grass on the left-hand side of the road, the spinifex is much older than the spinifex that's growing on the right-hand side of the road. So a few years ago, they actually burnt all the spinifex on this side. Now, for many thousands of years, as they travelled around their countryside, they were known to set fire to the old spinifex and clear out all the old vegetation. This helps to regenerate the land. Campfire smoke or bushfire smoke has many chemicals in it, some of which help with germination of the seeds of the plants. So when rain comes along, germination happens very quickly. Plants start to grow back, bear fruits. Some of them bear medicines and all different uses throughout their ways. And as the spinifex slowly grows back, so this starts to choke out some of those plants. So it creates diversity in the plant life, which in turn creates diversity in the animal life. And the bottom of the food chain out here is the spinifex. It's the main part of the ecology, and and the bottom of the food chain that feeds off that also are the termites. They're the main graziers of the desert, whereas in Africa the main graziers of the grass plains over there are the big herbivores. Here they are the termites. Yeah, the main predators out here were the reptiles. It's long before the settlement of Europeans, bringing in a lot of feral animals like feral cats, dogs, and cattle, things like that. The main reptiles were the main predators were the reptiles, which would feed off the termites in turn. So the termites would be the main harvesters of the cellulose from the spinifex and bring in other animals to feed off them. So this also becomes a much better hunting ground eventually. So over at 8 to 10 years, most areas with spinifex grass would have gone through a fire at some stage. So there are many facets and reasons why they actually set fire to these areas. Now, if you've got diversity in the plants around, it creates like a mosaic of different ages of the spinifex. So if we do get lightning strikes through summers, when we get electrical storms, we do get a bushfire going, once that bushfire starts to burn near an area that was burnt the previous year, that will act like a natural fire break. So also helps with keeping a balance in nature. This dark green shrub, which is about knee to waist high on the left hand side, is also a plant which is called tryptamine. Not these big bushes, but just the little dark green ones about knee to waist high is called tryptamine, and that acts like a natural fire break because it's a fire retardant and it doesn't burn very well. So generally they would burn the spinifex grass back towards the tryptamine. Now, a lot of plants out here need fire. Some of them are fire hardy, like the tall trees you see on the right hand side here, known as the kurakara to the unangu, or commonly called the desert oaks. These are part of the casuarina family. They have a very thick bark on them which protects them against bushfire, but also very, very slow growing trees. They put most of their growth into the root system of the plant before they'll branch out into large trees. So the tall, skinny ones that you see are much older than they look. They have been thought to be around 80 to 100 years old before they find a decent water table to draw moisture from, and then they will start to branch out and can live for as long as 800 years. Now these are very fire tolerant. The tessellated bark on them is also designed to channel water down to the roots, and also the long spindly leaves will also point downwards to try and channel moisture down to the main trunk of the tree. As we get a bit further up the track, we'll see a lot of acacia trees. These are quite fire sensitive. The acacias, known as the Acacia anura, these ones on the right hand side, are commonly known as the mulga trees. Now these are used by the unangu to make a lot of their wooden artifacts like boomerangs, music clapping sticks, digging sticks, the spear throwers, spear tips, and shields, and all sorts of implements. Now being that it's a very slow growing tree, the timber is very, very hard, very dense, and lasts for a very long time, and also highly sought after as a firewood because it holds the heat for a very long time and burns down into very large coals. So it was also used to cook on. They also find the jala, which is the honey ant, underneath the mulga trees. They live maybe 1 to 2 meters underground, and takes a very skilled person to find the honey ants, because the honey ants will extract the sweet sugar syrup off the plant and take it down to the storage ants that hide underground. So it's one of the very few sweet food sources available to the unangu people. Another plant out here which also produces a sweet nectar is the Kalinipa, which is honey grevillea. Now it's a flower that, or the tree is belonging to the Protea family and has a very long flower, almost a foot long, almost green and golden colour, and if you were to tap the flower on your hand it'll leave a thick residue of honey, and sometimes these were soaked in a bowl of water to actually produce a sweet drink. Now this time of the year, folks, especially through the heat of the day, we generally don't see much in the way of wildlife. Usually they will take shelter and hide from the heat, but walking up Walper Gorge, what you might be likely to find today is things like the Euros. Euros are the hill kangaroo. Sometimes can be seen in the shade along the creek bed, or the creek that runs through Walper Gorge. If you keep your eyes out down by the creek, sometimes we're lucky to see the Euro. Very solid, robust type of kangaroo, not much more than 4 to 5 foot tall. The Parenti is the second largest monitor in the world, the largest in Australia, and can grow up to 2 metres in length. And they also like to live around the rocky areas. So sometimes we're lucky to see the Parenti walking up through Walper Gorge as well. Out here on the sand dune country, you see the gold goanna, or the sandy goanna, and the skinks that like to hide in amongst the spinifex. Now, most of our wildlife out here is nocturnal, and if you were to come out here at night time, you'll find it teeming with life out here. But most of our animals are very, very small. Now, if you were to lift up all that spinifex off the sandy desert, you will actually find it teeming with life underneath all that spinifex grass. There are a few birds that you might find up Walper Gorge as well, things like the kestrel or the falcon. You do find them nesting up alongside the gorge as well. Now folks, Uluru and Kata are the European names to these two magnificent geological features, but also known as Ayers Rock and the Olgas. These European names came about by the explorers that first came out here in the 1870s, and one of the very first Europeans to travel up into Central Australia was John McDouall Stewart in 1860, and his job was to map the interior all the way to the north coast. Using his map, they built a telegraph line. This was built by Charles Todd, who connected Australia with communications to the rest of the world, and with the telegraph line pretty much dissecting Australia in half. Most of the eastern half of Australia from the telegraph line was fairly well explored, but mostly to the west of the telegraph line was just a void on the map. Now, one of the men that put his name to the test, who was sponsored by a German botanist who was also the head of the Melbourne Botanical Gardens, a guy called Baron Ferdinand von Mueller. He had a lot of explorers collect plant samples for him, and he got an explorer going into the field by the name of Ernest Giles. Now, Ernest Giles travelled up along the telegraph line to the Central Ranges, and Ernest wanted to be the first to travel from Central Australia to the Western Australian coastline. Now, it was to be quite a number of journeys before he was able to manage the crossing of the western deserts. But on his very first journey, travelling by horseback and a few companions, they made it to the northwest of the Central Ranges, or the McDonnell Ranges, and found that they were not equipped for the journey. As they came down along the edge of the Central Ranges, they came across an area which today is known as Wataka National Park. He named the George Gill Range and Kings Creek. That's where Kings Canyon is situated today. He named them after some of his financiers. A little bit further to the south of there, as he noticed it was good pastoral land around that area, he thought he'd travel a little bit further south. And in the distance he could see a large set of domes. Now he set off for these domes convinced that he would find water out here. But what lay between him and these domes was the largest salt lake in the Northern Territory, and he named it after his benefactor and called it Lake Uluru. He tried to cross it in various places but found it totally impassable, and also naming the highest dome Mount Ferdinand. He travelled back to South Australia, submitted his journal, and although Baron Ferdinand von Mueller was flattered his names were given to the area, he changed them, and he changed them to honour two other patrons of science, changing the name of the salt lake to honour the King of Spain, King Amadio, calling it Lake Amadeus. He also changed the name of the highest dome that stands at 1,066 metres above sea level to Mount Olga, and she was the daughter of Nicholas I, one of the Russian Tsars, and also the Queen of Baden-Württemberg. Now Giles travelled quickly back out to the region, but found himself 6 weeks behind another explorer, which was sponsored by the South Australian government, and his name was William Christie Goss. Now he travelled with camels. As he travelled out to this area, he named Mount Connor after a member of Parliament, which is a big flat-top mesa a little bit further to the east of here, and also naming Ayers Rock after the Chief Secretary of South Australia, Sir Henry Ayers. As he got out to this region, not being that tough of an explorer, he didn't really travel much further to the west of here. And when Giles came out here, he was very disappointed to see Goss's tracks in the sand, because Goss was approaching into the area that he was travelling. Not the done thing with exploration. Although Giles pressed on, one of the members in his party became lost and was never seen again, and his name was Alfred Gibson, hence the name of the Gibson Desert in this area. Although Giles went on and did another exploration journey, it was his last two that he managed to cross the Western Deserts, and he too went on to use camels. He finally made the coastline, but wasn't the first. Although he was beaten by the Warburton expedition, he did finally go on to publish his journal, which was known as Australia Twice Traversed. And he said that this area was, well, Mount Olga was the more wonderful and grotesque, whereas Mount Ayers was the more ancient and sublime. Well, folks, we're only a few minutes away from our first walk. There is a nice walk that goes up on top of a sand dune. It takes only 5 minutes to get up there, and that'll give you a nice side-on view or panoramic view of Kata, Tjuta. And then I'll spend a few minutes up there before heading back to the coach. It's an optional walk, and then we'll head on to Walmer Gorge.